Welcome to Lunch with the Lord. I'm Pastor Mark. We're in Ezra. We're going to be starting chapter 6 this lesson. But before we begin, Jeremiah 15:16, thy words were found, and I did eat them. And thy word was unto me the joy and the rejoicing of my heart. Now, chapter 6 will finish our first portion in the history of the returning Jews. Chapters 1 through 6 take approximately 20 years of history. And after chapter 6, there is a lifetime of years that pass before the beginning of chapter 7. There is about 60 years that pass between the end of chapter 6 and the beginning of chapter 7. In chapter 6, they will finish the rebuilding of the temple. Now, once the temple is finished in chapter 6, then approximately 60 years later, after the temple is finished, Ezra will travel to Jerusalem, and he will reform the people in Jerusalem in chapters 7 through 10. So Ezra chapters 1 through 6 deal with the building of the temple. And then there's about a 60-year gap, and then chapter 7 begins with Ezra coming to Jerusalem, and chapters 7 through 10 deal with, in a sense, the rebuilding of the people. You have the rebuilding of the temple, the first part of Ezra, and then the rebuilding of the people in the second part of Ezra. All right? So let's start in chapter 6, verse 1. And it says, Then Darius the king made a decree, and search was made in the house of the rolls, where the treasures were laid up in Babylon. Now it says here, the house of the rolls. And basically, this house of the rolls was the house of the archives. It was a state library. It wasn't your average public library that we think of, but it was a state library where official documents were made. So, search here was being made in Babylon, but the rolls were not there at Babylon. So they continued to search in other cities. If you go back to chapter 5, Ezra chapter 5 and verse 17, when Tatnai writes his letter to King Darius, he tells him to search. Now watch, he says, Now therefore, if it seem good to the king, let there be search made in the king's treasure house, which is at Babylon. So Tatnai thinks to himself, well, if there is such a decree, then it's got to be there in Babylon. So I'm asking you, King Darius, to please search in the treasures in Babylon for this decree, if there is a decree, all right? Whether it be so or not. Now, verse 2 says, And there was found at Achmetha in the palace that is in the province of the Medes a roll, and therein was a record thus written. Now, Achmetha, this name Achmetha is also known by another name, which is Ecbatana. So, Achmetha is Ecbatana. Now, Ecbatana was the summer residence of the Persian kings. And it was located, Ecbatana was located approximately 350 miles from Babylon and approximately 850 miles from Jerusalem. So Ecbatana was the capital of the Medes when Cyrus ruled. So this is obvious that when Cyrus wrote this decree, And he stored it away. He stored it away at Ecbatana, not at Babylon, because he wasn't there in Babylon. He ruled over Babylon, but he wasn't there. So now King Darius is ruling in Babylon, and he starts searching, and he searches in Babylon, but he doesn't find this decree. So where does he go next? Or he starts searching other places. Well, the next obvious place would be Ecbatana, where King Cyrus ruled. So they search in the house there, and they find this roll, all right, this scroll. Now, verses 3 through 6, we're going to finish this lesson in verses 3 through 6, and it deals with what King Cyrus wrote on that roll, what he wrote on the scroll, all right, what his decree was. So, verse 3 says, in the first year of Cyrus, the king, the same King Cyrus, the king made a decree concerning the house of God at Jerusalem. Let the house be builded, the place where they offered sacrifices, and let the foundations thereof be strongly laid, the height thereof 80 cubits, and the breadth thereof 80 cubits, with 3 rows of great stones, and a row of new timber, and let the expenses be given out of the king's house. And also let the golden and silver vessels of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar took forth out of the temple, which is at Jerusalem, and brought into Babylon, be restored, and brought again unto the temple which is at Jerusalem, every one to his place, and place them in the house of God. Now, therefore, Tatnai, governor beyond the river, Shetharboznai, and your companions, and the Arphaxagites, which are beyond the river, be ye far from thence. Now, so this is what he writes here. Remember now, in these verses, Cyrus is describing the rebuilding of the temple, not the rebuilding of the city of Jerusalem, only the temple. The city walls will be rebuilt about 90 years later when Nehemiah goes from Babylon to Jerusalem. Now, in verse 3, Cyrus decrees that the height of this temple should be 60 cubits or 90 feet high. But in 1 Kings chapter 6 and verse 2, Solomon's temple was only 30 cubits high or 45 feet high. And when it says here in verse 3 that the breadth of the house is to be 60 cubits, it probably means the length of the house, because this would agree with the same length of the original temple that Solomon built. If you look in 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 2, again, that the length of Solomon's house was the same as the breadth that King Cyrus brings up here. It would not be reasonable to have the height and the breadth as the same length. Now in verse 4 it says, with 3 rows of great stones and a row of new timber, right? 3 rows of stones and a row of timber, and then 3 rows of stones and a row of timber. So again, it's this, as I said a couple of lessons ago, it's the ratio of the stones and the wood agrees with the same ratio that King Solomon did when he built his temple in 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 36. Now, because the Jews 15 years earlier never mentioned about this decree kind of went into obscurity. 15 years ago, the Jews started building the temple. and opposition comes against them. And the sad the sad thing about it, and it's kind of like a question as to why they never did it. Why didn't they mention about Cyrus's decree? They had the decree of Cyrus on their side, and they never mentioned it. But here's these people building the temple. Opposition comes, and instead of telling their enemies that they have a decree from the king to build this temple, they don't say anything about it at all, and they just submit to their enemies. This decree by Cyrus was put on a shelf and would never have been touched if God hadn't spoken through his prophets Haggai and Zechariah. The decree was still in effect. You have to understand, even though the decree was on a shelf collecting dust and not being utilized by the Jews, it was still in effect. But it was not being used by the Jews to on their side to build this temple. All the promises and the blessings of God are active at this very moment for each one of us. But they will not be active in our life if the book is on a shelf. Listen, in the Bible, there are tremendous promises for each one of us. Promises from God, blessings from God. But the blessings won't be lived out. They won't be utilized in our life if the book stays on a shelf, collects dust. You can have tremendous, God has given tremendous blessings to each person for us here on earth to live by. But if we don't open the book and read the book, we can't be living in those promises. We won't be utilizing those promises in our life and making them available to us. Because the Bible's on a shelf. It's just collecting dust. We don't read it. We don't meditate upon it. We don't know what God has said. All right, we're going to continue on in verses 6 through 12 next lesson, and we're going to see in that lesson what Darius decreed. So in verses 1 through 5, we see what Cyrus decreed. And now in verses 6 through 12, we're going to see what does Darius say about Cyrus's decree. All right? Until then, walk with the Lord. I know he walks with you.